Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Making Connections, the Importance of Cross-Linguistic Transfer in Biliteracy Instruction. We will get started in just a moment. And in the meantime, feel free to join the chat and let us know where you are, what your role in education is, and what you would like to learn today. All right, I see we have a few folks joining us from Illinois, Washington, North Carolina, Wisconsin. Great to see you all today. And once again, welcome to Making Connections, the Importance of Cross-Linguistic Transfer in Biliteracy Instruction. My name is Shannon Ramlochin, and I'm a marketing manager at Amplify. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll email out the recording link for you to rewatch as you'd like. And everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance. We have a live captioner with us, so if you want to access the captions, click on Live Transcript in the bottom tray. And throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. And just another quick note that we have more webinars scheduled for this series. So if you haven't already signed up for more, please do. And catch our next session on creating a culture of community and professional learning at your school on Monday, November 28th. And you can find out about other webinars in this series and watch recordings of past webinars at amplify.com/SOR-everyone-fall 2022. All right, well, I think we can get started. So our agenda today is to discuss what is cross-linguistic transfer and give you some concrete examples of transferable language domains. And we're so excited to have Lauren Birner and Kajal Patel-Bilo joining us as today's co-hosts. Lauren is our Senior Professional Development Strategist for Biliteracy, and she works closely with school districts in their implementation of our Biliteracy suite and has worked in bilingual education her entire career. And Kajal is the Vice President of Spanish Solutions at Amplify. And in her role, Kajal collaborates and leads initiatives across our Spanish offerings and works with national experts in the field, maintaining a pulse on what schools and districts need to serve emergent bilinguals in Spanish. And with that, I will pass the mic to Lauren and Kajal. How are you today?
Hi, Shannon. I'm doing great. Thank you so much. So as Shannon mentioned, my name is Lauren Birner. I'm so excited to be here, particularly to be talking with you all about a topic that is very close to my heart. A couple of pictures there. You can see starting very early on in life, I had the great fortune of having parents who supported bilingualism and really saw it for the asset that it is. And that really sparked my career that eventually has really become my life and my passion. So I'm so excited to be here with you all, discussing the ways that we can really highlight cross-linguistic transfer and ensure that we're seeing our bilingual students as the superheroes that they are.
Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be here as well and seeing folks from all over the country. So I'm Kajal. I'm so passionate about language, and my wish, if I could have one talent, would be that I could speak all of them. I'm Indian American. My parents moved to Brooklyn from India and Kenya not long before I was born, and they speak 4 languages, but unfortunately they only taught me one of them, which is Gujarati. And I learned English when I was 3, and I later learned Spanish through study and working and living abroad in many places, including Spain, Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, and Mexico. And that's my family. That's it. That's us in Mexico, and my daughter's eating my favorite snack. But being multilingual has allowed me to connect and learn so much. And we have a huge population of students that can do that. More than 15% of our K-3 students in this country are emergent bilinguals. That is growing fast, and we have a responsibility to help them cultivate and expand that superpower. And that's what we're thinking about here every day as we support educators. And so we're going to jump right in now. At Amplify, we've based our work on these principles for biliteracy, and we strongly believe in the value and the celebration of biliteracy and the importance of cultivating it through instruction. And you'll see these guiding principles through our webinar today, specifically on cross-linguistic transfer. But before that, we have a very important question for you, which is, how do you know that the sea is friendly? You can put your answer in the chat. Because it waves. A lot of people saying that it waves. That's right. It's full of olas. So hola is waves in Spanish, and also has the same pronunciation as hola, hello. And so welcome to our webinar. So what exactly is cross-linguistic transfer? I invite you all to please put in your chat, what does cross-linguistic transfer mean to you? Why is it important? Similar words and or phonemes between languages, using what one knows in their first language to help access another one, making explicit connections, that the skills can transfer between languages, cousin languages. I love that. That's right, using skills in one language, supporting similar skills in the other. Absolutely. So we are super excited to talk to you more about this today. So cross-linguistic transfer is how students' knowledge and skills in one language, for instance, Spanish, can be used to support the development of similar skills in another language, for instance, English. And understanding this supports an asset-based approach to dual language development. A heritage language is an asset, not only in the sense that a student can speak it and honor their culture and the knowledge, but that that knowledge and skills can be applied directly to support literacy in the second language. However, it doesn't just happen. We know that it is important for us as educators to help students understand the interaction between English and Spanish to ensure that as much transfer occurs as possible. And research shows that when teachers explicitly teach students what transfers from one language to the other, the students are able to devote more cognitive processing time towards the more complex orthography and morphology systems of English that require more time than the transparent systems in Spanish. So in 1986, Philip Goff and Bill Tunmer proposed an easy way to understand the complex combination of skills that result in reading, and they called it the simple view of reading. And the main idea behind this simple view of reading is that the combination of language comprehension and word recognition is what leads students to gain meaning from text. So if either language comprehension skills or word recognition skills are lacking, students can't become skilled readers. And this is true in both English and Spanish. And so today we're going to represent English in navy blue and Spanish in the purple color, but know that English and Spanish are interchangeable in this graphical representation. So when we talk about word recognition, we're talking about skills that fall under the phonological awareness and alphabetic principle in both English and Spanish. And for our multilingual learners, Oracy supports vocabulary development and language comprehension. And as literacy builds in both languages, students strengthen their metalinguistic awareness that encompasses the ability to actively think about and talk about and manipulate the languages. And cross-linguistic transfer should be facilitated explicitly through a focus on both word recognition as well as language comprehension. And so I am now going to turn it over to my talented and knowledgeable colleague, Lauren Birner, to talk through the transferable language domains.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kajal. So as she just mentioned, we are going to be spending our time now thinking about the domains of language that can be used to promote cross-linguistic transfer. So that includes phonetics and phonology, morphology, syntax and grammar, semantics, as well as pragmatics. And while components of these domains might overlap, it can be helpful to think of them individually and how they'll impact language and literacy development. So we're going to take a look at some examples of cross-linguistic transfer that fall into phonetics and phonology first. So letter-sound correspondence falls into the domain of phonetics and phonology. To start out, we are going to compare English and Spanish at a high level. So English has double the sounds of Spanish. However, 92% of all of the sounds in English and Spanish have a direct correlation. And that provides us with the unique opportunity to really focus on that 8% of sounds that don't directly correlate and focus on those for explicit and direct instruction, which will not only save you valuable time and energy, but it'll also help, again, to recognize bilingualism as an asset for all of our students. So we are going to take a moment now, and I'd love to hear your answers in the chat about this question. Think about how many sounds does the letter A make in English? Too many. Yes, that's the truth. Too many. All right. See some 7s, 8s, 5s. So the letter A in English makes 6 sounds all by itself. So for those of you who said too many, yes, it makes 6 sounds all by itself, a single letter with 6 sounds, versus in Spanish, how many sounds does the letter A make? Perfect. That's exactly right. So la letra A en español hace un sonido, right? The letter Spanish makes only, or the letter A in Spanish makes only 1 sound. So English vowels are some of what falls into that 8% of letter sounds, where Spanish-speaking students need explicit instruction to learn the new sounds. However, the consonants are nearly identical in English and Spanish, as you can see here, which means that students don't need to learn these letter sounds twice. We, again, can save valuable instructional time by teaching students how the sounds are shared between the 2 languages, and again, teaching them to be language detectives and recognizing where these 2 languages do connect and where they can use their skills in one to help understand the other. So when we look at areas where explicit instruction is needed for English learners, we can focus on just a few consonant sounds. So you can see here. We also have the vowel sounds that are unique to English, like the short I in pig, the short O in pot, and schwa sounds like p. We also focus on those R-controlled vowels, which can also be incredibly difficult for our English learners. There are 3 unique digraphs that are important to explicitly instruct on. And then finally, we have a couple of unique digraphs and diphthongs that won't directly transfer. So for our English learners, it's important to make sure that these are being explicitly taught because their lack of a similar sound in the Spanish language. So while these are all of the pieces that we need to explicitly teach in English, there are actually only 3 unique Spanish sounds that our Spanish language learners will have to master. So you can see them here. We have the first sound as in jota. We have R and doble R, right? Those are all sounds that are unique to the Spanish language, and there really isn't a companion in the English language. So thinking about what this looks like in our classroom, I'd love to hear some examples in the chat as I share these couple of examples with you all. So when students are learning sound letter correspondence from English to Spanish or Spanish to English, there are some very common errors that we're likely to see with the 8% of letters and sounds that don't have a direct correlation. So for example, an English speaker learning Spanish is likely to pronounce ella as ella when they first encountered in Spanish. So in Spanish, doble L is pronounced as the y sound, right? Which is a departure from the English pronunciation of the common consonant sound ul. So similarly, they might pronounce helado as helado because H, right, that sound is pronounced in English and not in Spanish. In contrast, we see similar errors with Spanish speakers who are learning English. So for instance, Spanish speakers often pronounce and write the sound as the consonant D, the consonant D, or the sound D, because does not exist in Spanish. And so students approximate by producing its closest companion and make an approximation, right? Not necessarily an error. They're using what they know in one language. So they might spell the word father as fodder. Another common error that you might see is something like students writing espagueti, right? This happens oftentimes because in Spanish, words don't normally begin with a consonant cluster. So something like spaghetti doesn't exist in Spanish. So espagueti, again, is another approximation using what they know in one language to help support their development in another. Because of the regular and transparent orthography of Spanish compared to the very opaque orthography of English, there are other common examples that we often see with our Spanish-speaking students, including long and short vowel errors like ship and sheep. Since short vowels do not exist in Spanish, and because the letter I in Spanish is pronounced the same as the long E in English, it can be difficult for a Spanish speaker to distinguish. Another error or common approximation that you might see is that the consonants B and V are particularly difficult for Spanish-speaking students to distinguish because they're nearly identical in Spanish. So berry, as in strawberry, and berry, as in berry sad, would be pronounced the same way. That's why we have to say things like be de vaca in Spanish, right? And so our English speakers learning Spanish will need support in some sounds as well. And that includes the ñ, which I have seen in the chat a couple of times. It also includes doble L. It includes their rolling R's for r, and also the instruction on how to use the diaresis to pronounce the U in words like pingüino. So you can see here, again, that whether a student is Spanish speaking, learning English, or vice versa, there are some common approximations that we as educators can learn to recognize. And we're going to learn more about how in just a moment. But before we do that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question because it's one that I think is a common misconception. So, verdadero o falso, true or false? A teacher must speak Spanish to support Spanish-speaking students in making connections from Spanish to English. Great. Looks like most of you landed on false. I did see one person say it helps. Absolutely, it helps. But teachers should not feel discouraged in supporting their students who are Spanish speaking because there are ways that they can still support cross-linguistic transfer without actually speaking the language itself. So a teacher can look at the cross-linguistic transfer report provided in our program. And specifically here, we're looking at phonological awareness. Here you can find specific examples that will help students develop phonological awareness in both languages. And this guidance will direct teachers to look to the language-specific characteristics table included in the report. So this is one example of guidance that a teacher who may or may not be Spanish speaking can use, not only to help better interpret and understand their students' acquisition of skills, but also to help support that cross-linguistic transfer. So here teachers will be able to find guidance on those language-specific characteristics, which of course can then help inform their phonological awareness instruction. Next, we're going to look at the domain of morphology. So morphology in linguistics is the study of word formation. I saw quite a few people reference already some roots in the chat. And so morphology falls into this idea that some words, right, cognates and false cognates fall into morphology. That means that some words are nearly identical in English and Spanish, but we also have false cognates, of course, which we'll talk about in a moment. There are also many shared prefixes and suffixes in English and Spanish. We also share inflected endings in English and Spanish, which again, all of these are examples of ways that we might provide opportunities for positive cross-linguistic transfer. So coming to cognates now, which I think is one of my favorite things, not only to laugh about with colleagues, but just to utilize with students to help them recognize exactly what they're seeing and how they can utilize what they know in one language to support the other. So cognates are words that are nearly identical in English and Spanish. And so often you can rely on your knowledge of English to understand words in Spanish and vice versa. So here are a couple of examples of cognates. We have chocolate and chocolate, which are pure cognates, which means that they're instantly recognizable and they only differ in their pronunciation between English and Spanish. Another example is hospital or hospital. Again, they are almost identical. They differ only in their pronunciation. And even more common than these pure cognates are words like celebration and celebración. So they are instantly recognizable, but we form that suffix shun and sion differently in English and Spanish. But the important thing for students to learn to recognize is that although they look different, that suffix has the same meaning in both languages. So on to my favorite part of this, which is false cognates, right? I'm sure all of you can think of a funny anecdote around false cognates, but these are really important to be aware of. So it's super important to recognize that certain words that appear to be the same might not actually be the same in the two languages. So one example is sopa. So in Spanish, sopa does not mean soap, but rather it means soup. So definitely don't want to mix those two things up. And another example is that the word pie, spelled pie, right, pronounced pie in Spanish, does not mean pie, right? It actually means foot. So this is important to recognize, just as it's important to recognize where there's positive transfer, it's important to recognize where an acquisition in both languages might cause some confusion, right? There's potential for misconceptions here, and it's important for students to recognize that. So another piece that's really important to recognize is that Spanish and English share many Latin and Greek roots and many prefixes, which can really help us to understand the meaning of words in one language if we know the meaning in the other language. So celebración was one of those examples, that's a suffix, but again, using that in one language will help support the other. You can see here a number of those shared prefixes in English and Spanish, re, in, con, and sub, again, or review and repasar. Using those prefixes in English and Spanish although the words themselves are different, right? We don't see many cognates here. What we do see is that we have the same prefix and it means the same thing. The same goes for suffixes. So even though, again, the spelling is slightly different, like our example, sion and shun, as well as ismo and ism, edad and eti, and iente and ent. These are all examples of suffixes that are shared in meaning, although their spelling and their pronunciation are slightly different. It's another aspect of both languages that can be used to help support their understanding in either language. Another area that can be helpful for direct instruction, or really important to directly instruct, is inflected endings. So it's really common for us to hear Spanish speakers say something like, I kicked the ball instead of I kicked the ball, or I hugged my mom instead of I hugged my mom, or he landed the plane rather than landed. And so this, again, provides an opportunity to teach students when to use the hard D, the ed, or the t ending, depending on the phonics of a particular word in English. So where there are differences between the two languages, these pieces that don't directly transfer, it provides us an opportunity, again, to ensure that our students are becoming language detectives and that they're learning where there's predictability in this language and where they'll begin to recognize these rules that are really unique to English or to Spanish. So thinking about what this might look like in the classroom, you might hear a student say or write something like, el boy is playando soccer, right? So this student has expressed a complete and comprehensible sentence with their full linguistic repertoire, right? Which is incredible. This is a sentence to be celebrated. And so even though this child has mixed English and Spanish in the same sentence, they've also used the correct endings forming each of these words, right? They've used these and approximated as they mix the two languages. So this is an opportunity to do a couple of different things. First, we can reinforce English articles and also to explicitly teach the ando ending, which in English would be ing, right? Playing. So again, when we explicitly show students how sentences are the same and different in each language, we increase their ability to transfer language in additional contexts. So again, teachers can look to the cross-linguistic transfer guidance, whether or not they themselves are Spanish speaking. They can start to recognize things like the prefixes and suffixes that are similar across the two languages. This guidance also will provide you, again, with professional development so that regardless of whether or not you speak both languages, you're able to support your students and recognize where they are making those approximations that should be celebrated versus where they are truly making mistakes that need additional instruction. So moving on to our next domain, we are going to take a look now at syntax and grammar. So when we think about syntax and grammar, it encompasses things like word order, shared articles, although we know that in Spanish, articles are gendered. We have to think about the conjugation of verbs and how those might differ. We also want to think about possessive nouns in English. And we'll also think and talk about reflexive verbs. So even though reflexive verbs exist in both English and Spanish, they're far more common in Spanish. So taking a look first at word order, both Spanish and English follow a subject, verb, object word order that transfers easily for students, but there are some subtle differences that really do necessitate that explicit instruction. So in English, we would say, you have a pretty flower, which follows that subject, verb, object order. while in Spanish, we would say, tú tienes una flor bonita, right? Which also follows that same order, subject, verb, object. However, in English, adjectives are generally placed before the object, while in Spanish, the adjectives follow the object. In addition to that, both English and Spanish share articles. However, Spanish has gendered articles. And because flor is a feminine noun, both the article and the adjective are gendered feminine. The next piece to look at is conjugation, right? Conjugation is something that exists in both English and Spanish. Both languages conjugate verbs, but Spanish conjugation is much more specific, which often renders the subject pronoun unnecessary, because we know that you is implied by the conjugation of tienes. The pronoun, tú is not necessary to convey the meaning in the sentence, right? You have a pretty flower. We need to include that you to indicate who it is that we're talking about. In Spanish, though, we don't have to say tú tienes una flor bonita, because tienes already implies or already tells us who it is that we're talking about. Another difference in English and Spanish is in the way that we show possession. So when we talk about Anna's pretty flower in English, we use the apostrophe S. However, in Spanish, we show possession with the word de. So instead of Anna's flower is pretty, we have to say la flor de Ana is pretty, or es bonita. Wow, there we go, right? There's mixing two languages. So thinking now about reflexive verbs, which I referenced earlier, these are something, again, that exist in both languages. So both English and Spanish have reflexive verbs, but Spanish uses reflexives much more often. So in English, we show reflexive verbs by adding self to the pronouns. So we have some examples here. I put myself to bed, herself, they put themselves to bed. So again, we're adding self to show that reflexive verb. However, in Spanish, the conjugation of the verb itself changes. So instead of saying I put myself to bed, me acosté indicates that same fact. So this again is something where conceptually there's a transfer, but in practice, the way that this looks in both languages is slightly different. It still necessitates that explicit instruction. So again, thinking about what this looks like in your classrooms. A Spanish speaker might make an error like this one. They might say the flower of Ana is pretty. And so again, this is a sentence to be celebrated. I hesitate to even use the word error, right? It's an approximation. And so this is a comprehensible sentence in English that just needs a minor adjustment. And so we can use this type of sentence as an opportunity to provide explicit instruction on possessives. And similarly, an English speaker may make an error in word order in Spanish. So they might say something like, Ana tiene una bonita flor, right? So they might be using what they know in English. And because of that, they might have reversed the order of the words in that sentence. So after celebrating what the student has approximated, it's important then to remind students and take this as a moment for explicit instruction that in Spanish, generally we put the adjective after the noun. So again, thinking about what this looks like across different classrooms and different districts, anywhere you can imagine, we don't necessarily need to be Spanish speaking to be able to help support this positive transfer, this cross-linguistic transfer. So you can see here in the guidance that you can find reminders about syntax and grammar that both positively transfer and those pieces that negatively transfer between the two languages. As you continue to scroll down on those reports, you'll find even more information, more specific information on how to support students with their syntax and grammar in both languages. Great, so now we're going to take a look at our next domain, which is semantics. So semantics is one of the more interesting parts of language, I think, and it's the study of word meaning, and it's really critical for our language learners. So things like synonyms and antonyms, homonyms and homophones, euphemisms and dysphemisms, multiple meaning words, and also idioms fall into this domain of semantics, and they provide, again, great opportunities for explicit vocabulary instruction. So both English and Spanish have many synonyms and antonyms that provide opportunities to help students develop a robust vocabulary in both languages. However, knowing the precise meaning of words will help students to know when to use words with similar meanings and when to use an antonym that would be more appropriate. So all of these synonyms in English imply size. However, knowing their exact meaning might not be enough when we want to use precise language. So one simple example is the word fat, right? In English, we may use a euphemism like overweight when describing people, but we wouldn't have the same hesitation in describing a dog as fat, right? Similarly, in Spanish, the word gorda, which does mean fat, actually is a term of endearment. So an English speaker might be offended if someone referred to them as gorda, not understanding the cultural relevance and that nuance of the word. So when we look to antonyms, we can see in English a very commonly used word like hot is used for many situations, from the temperature of things, the weather, the climate, and even food. And this is important to recognize because this might have different synonyms and antonyms in Spanish, depending on the use and the context. So again, the word specificity plays a really important role in communicating effectively, and it's one of those nuanced pieces of language that's important to not only recognize, but explicitly instruct for all of our students. Both English and Spanish also have homonyms and homophones, and these are another piece that can be confusing for language learners, in that homonyms, or words with the same spelling and sound but differ in meaning, can be words that are incredibly difficult to understand because one must rely on the meaning for comprehension. So here's an example: a dog barking, right, or tree bark are spelled the same way. Those two barks look and sound exactly the same way, but they have very different meanings. Similarly, in Spanish, the word cara, or face in Spanish, also means expensive. And so they have the same spelling and pronunciation, but very different meanings as well. And students rely then on understanding the context in which those words are being used. And it's important to recognize that. We also have common homophones, which are words with the same pronunciation, but different spellings. And these are another component of language that can be challenging for language learners. So a common English example is here and here, the difference between location or actually hearing something, right, using your ears. And then in Spanish, an example would be coser or coser, right? They're spelled and sound exactly the same, or they're spelled differently, sound exactly the same, but the meaning is very, very different. Okay, the next piece is one of the ones that I find the most interesting. So English and Spanish both have euphemisms, or a more pleasant way to describe or explain a difficult subject. And we also have dysphemisms, which is a more disparaging way to describe something that might confuse language learners as well. So both English and Spanish use euphemisms to say that someone died. So in English, we would say he passed away, or in Spanish, pasó a mejor vida, which is passed to a better life, right, if we directly translate that. In contrast, though, both languages also use phrases to disparage things. So in English, we call fast food junk food, and in Spanish, we call it comida basura, or literally translated garbage food. Another component of language that can be particularly tricky for language learners is multiple meaning words. And for words that have even more meanings, the trickier it becomes, right, the more meanings that they have. So thinking of some examples, in English, we have words like tie. So tie can not only mean a necktie, it could mean that a game is tied, it could even mean that someone's hands are tied and they can't take action. Those are pieces, again, that can be incredibly tricky when we're relying more on the context of the language than just the individual word itself to have an understanding of what's being communicated. Spanish has similar multiple meaning words. One example is carrera. So that's a race or an opportunity. So these are pieces in both English and Spanish where we really do have an opportunity for direct instruction. We can help students to develop vocabulary when we explicitly point out those words with multiple meanings. Idiomatic phrases might be the most challenging aspect of semantics for language learners because these phrases are so divergent from their literal meanings, but they can be some of the most fun to explore with your students. So some common examples in English might be, don't put all your eggs in one basket, meaning don't risk it all, or it was a piece of cake, or it was easy. So Spanish has just as many idiomatic phrases like estás como una cabra, which literally translated would be you're acting like a goat, right? And that's not an idiom in English, but what it means is that you're being a little crazy. Another one is él no tiene pelos en la lengua, which is literally he doesn't have hairs on his tongue, or he tells it like it is. And so many of these phrases have a similar counterpart in the other language, and this is a really fun way to explore expressions with students that help to promote fluency in both languages. So thinking about, again, what this might look like in your classroom, you might do something like hang a chart of idiomatic phrases in each language. So looking at both languages side by side is a really great way to support your students in learning a second language. So again, many of these phrases have a similar counterpart in the other language, like this one. In English, we say she has her head in the clouds. And in Spanish, we would say ella está en las nubes, or literally translated, she is in the clouds. So having a chart to reference this can help students to remember new phrases and vocabulary. And as a class, it's fun to continue to add to the chart as new phrases pop up throughout the course of the year. And I think it's always incredibly surprising for many folks, particularly folks who have never learned a second language or might be monolingual, how important it is to understand idiomatic expressions to really be able to interact meaningfully with different texts, with different types of media. It's incredibly important and they're so common. So it's great to do it with your students to continue to add to their repertoire, to their knowledge by looking at idiomatic expressions. So we have a couple of additional examples of idioms that don't have the same literal translation, like kick the bucket in English and estirar la pata in Spanish, which means to stretch the leg. But both of these are actually dysphemisms, meaning to die. So having idioms like this, again, side by side, can help students to make this connection, right? It still means the same thing. However, it is not directly translated, and it helps our learners develop new vocabulary in both languages. So I'd love to hear from you all in the chat if you have a favorite idiom, either in English or in Spanish. Hold your horses, cuesta un ojo de la cara. It's raining cats and dogs, consultar la almohada. Those are great. Cats got your tongue. Perfect. These are all great to share, and I would just encourage you all to look at these from the lens of a language learner, right? It sounds very silly to say something like, I could eat a horse, if we don't understand the meaning. And so again, thinking about how teachers can support their students to help with this cross-linguistic transfer, to help build upon their skills in one language, you can look to this report for more information on how to develop vocabulary. And it also provides you with a resource that gives you a list of common idioms that will help you to help your students make these semantic transfer connections. Those examples, again, are provided in both English and in Spanish. All right, so we are going to explore one last transferable domain of language that sometimes is overlooked, and that's pragmatics. So while semantics is the study of word meaning, pragmatics deals in what is unsaid when two people are communicating. So this includes things like cultural norms, which include both physical and social norms. It also includes the idea of how something is said, as well as how something is being interpreted by the listener. So when we talk about physical and social cultural norms, we're talking about aspects that are common, but not uniform for all people in a culture. So these are not generalizations. These are, however, common things that can be seen, and having a better understanding of them will help teachers and help all of us to understand not only the folks around us, but help understand our students better. So physical cultural norms play a large role in how two people communicate. So when people from different cultures interact, the differences in these norms can feel off between the two individuals. So one of these examples is eye contact. That's often an important cultural norm for many people in the US, which can convey respect to the speaker. We might hear something like, look at me when I'm speaking to you. It's a phrase that we hear from authority figures often in the United States, either at home or at school. However, in many cultures, including some Hispanic cultures, some children actually look away from authority figures to show deference to the speaker. So understanding this cultural difference can help to prevent pragmatic misunderstandings between two communicators. So in a school setting, it's important to understand that a student who does not make eye contact might not be demonstrating defiance, but rather actually demonstrating respect. Similarly, personal space is not as important to many cultures as it is to some people living in the United States. So it might feel uncomfortable to have someone stand too close to you or too far away, depending on your personal cultural norm. Another area within this domain is gestures. So gestures might feel animated or subdued depending on the speaker's cultural norm. And it might feel overdone to one participant in a conversation, or as if the other participant is unengaged if they don't share the same cultural norms. Providing students with explicit instruction on how two people communicating may differ culture to culture and situation to situation can help to avoid misunderstandings. And it's also a great way to allow students to see the world around them through new perspectives. So not to say that one norm is the preferred norm, but rather to teach students where these differences might exist. And not only for students, but for other educators as well, to recognize where these norms might differ. Thinking about social norms, they also play an incredibly important role in communication. So how we address and greet each other is important in every culture, but knowing the differences between cultures is just as important. So in my own experience, I've had colleagues in the United States take offense when their students call them maestra or maestro, incorrectly assuming that the student is calling them teacher, meaning that they might not know their teacher's name. However, in many Hispanic cultures, calling someone teacher is a demonstration of deep respect, right? So hearing the word maestra is not a sign of disrespect, right? It is students showing deep respect. Another example is the use of the words Mr. or Mrs. when addressing an authority figure. Some cultures might view that as cold and instead use words like abuela or tía or tío to show respect. In many cultures, authority or respect for authority figures or elders is also paramount in communication. So students might be animated and chatty with friends and quiet or more subdued with teachers whom they view as authority figures. So this again might lead to the misunderstanding that a student is not engaged or not attending to schoolwork if it were interpreted inaccurately. Personal questions might also be treated differently in different cultures. So in some Hispanic cultures, asking personal questions is an important way to show that you care for the individual that you're speaking to. And if one does not spend enough time on those pleasantries or on those questions in a conversation, it might be considered rude or impersonal. Conversely, for many folks living in the United States, someone who talks at length with a lot of details might actually be considered rude for taking a lot of the other person's time. Punctuality is another part of professional and social life in the United States that is often important, and being late even to a social function is often considered impolite. However, in many cultures, showing up at the designated time might actually be viewed as inconsiderate, as your host might not be ready for you. So in many Latin American countries, arriving later than the designated time is not only common, but actually expected. Storytelling is also an important example of differences in our cultural communication or social communication, I should say. So for many of us living in the United States and other countries, we tell stories in a very linear fashion from start to finish. But other cultures might tell stories in a more circular fashion, where time is less important, which can appear to a linear storyteller that the speaker is not getting to the point, and again, might be taking a lot of the other person's time. So oftentimes how something is said is just as important as what is said when we're thinking about pragmatics in language. For example, in English, I'm sorry is an appropriate way to communicate sorrow or remorse for anything, right? From the death of a loved one to bumping into a stranger on a train. But in Spanish, we reserve lo siento for something particularly grave, like death, and it would be much more appropriate to say perdóname for bumping into someone on the train. So while the sentiment is similar, the shades of meaning are super important here. Another common example is the sentiment to love. So in English, it's acceptable to love everything, right? We love our spouses, our children, our mugs, our dogs. That idea, we use love fairly loosely. However, in Spanish, we really have to distinguish between different ways to express that sentiment depending on who we are talking about or what we're talking about. So te amo is for a deep loved one, right? Or te quiero to tell someone we love them. We, though, if we were talking about a mug, would not say amar, right? We would not use that verb in Spanish. Instead, we would say me encanta. So knowing when to use each sentiment can save embarrassment when two people are communicating and can also just help us to better interact with one another. Interpretation is also just as important when communicating between two cultures. So in English, we often couch requests with words to indicate how much we appreciate someone doing something for us, like passing the salt, right? We might say, would you mind passing me the salt? However, in Spanish, pásame la sal, which again is pass me the salt, would sound much more direct to an English speaker. This, however, does not mean that the Spanish speaker is being inconsiderate, but rather because in Spanish, something as simple as passing the salt, especially between two people who know each other well, is not considered an inconvenience, right? It's a simple request. You simply pass the salt because someone else needs it. Another example is the subtle difference in a question like, can I borrow your pen? In English, our requests tend to be more speaker-centered. Can I borrow your pen? While in Spanish, we might say, me regalas tu pluma, right? So literally translated, would you gift me your pen? But the speaker, of course, still is asking, can I borrow your pen? So thinking again about what this looks like in practice in our classrooms, directly and explicitly teaching students pragmatic norms is an important and often overlooked function of communication. So taking the time to explicitly explain the differences in culture for something as simple as personal space, or again, the way that students might be showing respect differently, is incredibly important and can go such a long way in classrooms. So we hope that this has deepened your knowledge of cross-linguistic transfer, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Kajal to finish out.
Thank you, Lauren. That was amazing. So much information and so little time. And I think a lot of people want to be able to reference that later, based on the comments in the chat and the questions. So yeah, we will be sending out the recording. And so I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes to wrap up. How can assessment and instruction tools support cross-linguistic transfer? We have a robust suite for English literacy based on the science of reading, and we must deliver equity for our Spanish-speaking students with the same tools. And so in a science-based reading system, we must have universal screening in the home language, as well as the language of instruction, as well as high-quality instruction in the home language and the language of instruction. So I want to show you a couple of examples from our assessment and our instruction, particularly from our assessment. You know, when a child whose home language is Spanish is assessed in English, we don't have the full picture. We have data that shows there was a study from the University of Oregon that was done where Spanish-speaking pre-K students were assessed in Spanish. When they were assessed in English, 63% of them were identified as tier 2 or tier 3. But when assessed in Spanish, that number was 21%, which demonstrates a significant underestimation of student ability. So we have to have the whole picture of the student's assets. When students are assessed in both DIBELS 8th edition and M-Class DIBELS 8th edition and M-Class Lectura, teachers have access to a dual language report, which give a side-by-side view of a student's strengths and opportunities for growth. And this helps teachers to understand where they can leverage cross-linguistic transfer and translanguaging to support the development in a second language. And so here we can see Marco's overall literacy, which shows that his Spanish is on track, and his Spanish skills are strong. And the teacher's then able to see that that can be leveraged to build those skills in English. If we go to the next slide, we can see that in that same report, there is information given to teachers, built-in professional development across skill areas to support cross-linguistic transfer. Lauren shared many of these resources earlier, and this is exactly their access through this report so that teachers are given this information in the context of their own students' data. And shifting over to curriculum and how we support cross-linguistic transfer in curriculum, we have the Caminos Spanish Language Arts program. Both our CKLA and Caminos Language Arts programs are built on the simple view of reading with an explicit focus on language comprehension through read-alouds that facilitate knowledge building and foundational skills that provide practice with decoding and writing. We talked about the importance of that for both languages. In particular, there's bilingual connections to support transfer. So as students are learning, teachers can be intentional about providing bridges between the two languages. In this example, there are 5 consistent vowel sounds in Spanish, as we talked about before, and more than 5 in English. And this way, teachers are able to explicitly show the differences and the similarities and talk about them. In addition, attention is given to cognates in the texts. And so I'm going to stop there because we only have a minute, and I want to allow just a couple minutes at the end for questions. Where can I see more of the Caminos curriculum? Yes, we can put a link to where to find more information here on our website.
Hi, it's Shannon again. And I saw a great question in the chat. Will you clarify translanguaging? What does that mean?
Sure. So I think translanguaging right now is one of those terms that might mean something different to different people. But when we think about translanguaging, what we mean particularly in the context of cross-linguistic transfer in this presentation is the idea that students are sort of moving between two languages, right? Our bilingual students are not two monolingual brains in one, right? They are bilingual. And so that practice of translanguaging or approximating using both languages is something that we do see often in our bilingual students. So that example of, I think it said, el boy is playando soccer, right? That's an example of a student approximating using both languages. And so that would be an example of translanguaging. Great question.
Yes, thanks everybody for your engagement throughout this webinar. And thank you to Lauren and Kajal again. This was a really fun webinar, and I think everybody here learned so much. And so I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow you will get an email with a link to the recording and your certificate of attendance. And we have so much more information to share with you in the other webinars in this series. So again, you can register for more webinars by visiting amplify.com/SOR-everyone-fall 2022. So thank you again so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.